Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Newcomb. It is widely suspected North Korea's nuclear test could be imminent, and the U.S. repeatedly says it'll respond swiftly and robustly to a nuclear test. Meanwhile, at the UN General Assembly, many UN members voiced criticism toward China and Russia for vetoing more UN sanctions on North Korea. Now, all eyes are on North Korea, whether it'll actually conduct its 7th nuclear test. And if it does, what are the measures that can be taken? Today, we discuss these and more.
They've obviously done the preparations and my understanding is they could test any time.
We cannot do anything other than take the course of action that we think is strong, steadfast, and clear.
In the studio with me today is William Newcomb, fellow at the Center for Advanced Defense Studies. Mr. Newcomb was a member of the panel of experts on North Korea sanctions at the United Nations. He also served as deputy coordinator of the U.S. State Department's North Korea Working Group. Also joining me is Scott Snyder. Mr. Snyder is senior fellow for Korea Studies and director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the studio. Good to have you both in person.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, the U.S. government is assessing North Korea's nuclear test can take place anytime. And U.S. officials, Sung Kim and Wendy Sherman and Jake Sullivan, they all said North Korea's nuclear test will be met by a swift and robust response. Mr. Newcomb, these remarks came after a number of trilateral meetings between U.S., South Korea, and Japan. Do you think these three countries are now well aligned on this issue?
Well, I suspect that the three countries have aligned their positions, and the range of responses that they might take if a test is conducted. There are several things that go into a test. North Korea doesn't conduct a test just for political purposes. They're very expensive. So it tests to advance its nuclear program. And the timing means that first you've got to be prepared. And they've been working on the tunnels. It could be that they're prepared today. It could be they're prepared a week or 2 weeks from now. So that's very indeterminate. Then North Korea has the option of choosing the date to get maximum effect from the test when it conducts it. A lot of times in history, they've chosen sensitive dates for the U.S. to conduct a test. So that could be coming up. There's another factor that no one's bringing into this equation. Right now, IAEA is meeting on the case of Iran. Iran has dismantled the cameras. Iran and North Korea, as most people know, are like with China, as close as lips and teeth, particularly in the missile program, possibly also in the nuclear program. So they may be waiting to see what happens there. They may reassess if the U.S. and the EU3 go back to the UN for snapback. That could send a different kind of signal to North Korea.
What could be a swift and robust response?
In terms of this swift and robust, clearly, if they have pre-negotiated a response with Japan and South Korea, it can be multilateral swift, it can be unilateral swift, but the rigor of the response, how robust it is, that's another question. Let me just restrict myself to sanctions. If they go after, as they have traditionally, North Korean entities, North Korean individuals in North Korea, that's not a very rigorous type of response. If they go after network disruption in third countries, which generally previous administrations have been reluctant to do, that would be a very effective response.
Well, I believe that the South Korean Foreign Minister Park Jin specifically mentioned robust deterrence, and so I'm expecting that the response to be around the issue of providing assurance to South Korea and signaling to North Korea strong disapproval and resoluteness with regard to military readiness. And so what that probably means is that there will be some kind of military action in response to a test, most likely related to bringing in strategic assets to the theater as a way of signaling disapproval for North Korea's current direction. The problem, I think, that exists for the administration is how North Korea responds and interprets what the US, South Korea, and Japan are signaling. And in this respect, I think that the challenge is that in the Trump administration, military action could be a prelude to conflict, but with a conventional foreign policy like the Biden administration's, it's more likely that the North Koreans will interpret military signaling as an alternative to conflict, in which case they would see that they have an open pathway to conduct a test. Or they might think that they have an open pathway to conduct a test.
Right.
If I could just add a
Sure.
quick footnote on that. I mean, should Scott be right and they go for some kind of a military show like that, that also has been done in the past. And the North Korean response has been to escalate its alert level, mobilize the military, and generate a lot of propaganda about the threat of war being directed at it by the US and how it's now justified in all of these, pursuing all these prohibited programs.
So the danger I think that the North Koreans face is that they may also perceive that they can control the escalation and that they have at their disposal the ability to turn off the escalation and to open a channel for some kind of dialogue at any time. But that also is an assumption that North Korea is making. And it could be an area where you could see the risk of miscalculation.
Absolutely.
Now North Korea is holding a party meeting this week, and they must know that the world is watching them right now, right? Mr. Newcomb, do you think North Korea is still weighing decisions on the nuclear test, or is it already made?
I suspect they have decided to test, but again, it's the timing. China certainly, in my view anyway, would not want to see a test at this time. The situation's complicated. They're still fighting COVID. Their economy suffered a downturn. The threats to international investment in the area from a test would hurt Chinese recovery efforts. So they might say that, well, we know you're going to test sometime, but hold off, don't do it now. Russian view, which is also influential in Pyongyang, I don't know. I can see Russia not wanting to see more development of North Korea's nuclear capacity and capabilities. At the same time, they might welcome the diversion that this presents to the war they're waging in the Ukraine. So it's really hard to figure. And actually, it's going to be Pyongyang's decision. And no matter what China or Russia says, they'll make it on their own terms.
Mr. Snyder, do you agree this is only a matter of timing now?
With regards to the meeting, we're not going to hear from the North Koreans until later on whether or not a decision has been made at this meeting. We saw in 2016 that the North Koreans conducted a test and then they revealed the order with Kim Jong-un's signature on it, indicating that the decision had been made several weeks prior to the decision to test. And so I think it's likely that it would play out in the same way this time.
If we look back at the time when North Korea conducted its 5th or 6th nuclear test, the international community responded by imposing more sanctions. And the UN Security Council recently, very recently, has pushed for additional sanctions over North Korea's array of recent missile tests, but the move was blocked by China and Russia. Mr. Snyder, will these countries react differently if it was nuclear test?
Well, it remains to be seen. And I do think that this poses a bit of a challenge for China. But the geostrategic circumstances are very different now compared to the way they were before, with an open competition between the US and China, and the Russians involved in a war of aggression against Ukraine. And so, in a way, the big difference as we look at the peninsula itself, again, going back to 2015, 2016, the Chinese sent a signal of disapproval as related to North Korea's conduct of the January 2016 nuclear test that Kim Jong-un did not feel obliged to heed. But that was at a time when Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un did not have a direct personal relationship. Now they do have a direct personal relationship, but I think that in the course of developing that personal relationship, the priority of China on denuclearization has declined, and the priority of China on maintaining stability for North Korea has increased, because it's viewing North Korea as having geostrategic value. And so where the Chinese end up coming out on this, it's very hard to say. I don't think that they're going to be happy about another nuclear test, but I'm not sure that they're going to voice much disappointment publicly.
Mr. Newcomb, what's your thought on this?
Well, as Scott said, the situation's changed dramatically. Let's back up to after the last resolution and look at the behavior. Let's take China. The tempo of prohibited shipments of oil and coal in the East China Sea has really picked up. We have designated ships operating in Chinese waters, carrying these prohibited cargoes. And when the panel of experts asked China to look into it, they got the typical condescending, bland, non-response that China has been giving for some years. So clearly they are cooperating closely with the North Koreans, possibly because they were concerned that the North Korean economy was not functioning very well, and China has always been attentive to preventing a North Korean collapse. On the Russian side, since around 2018, we have seen a considerable number of examples of short-range missile tests, as well as the long-range. There have been a number of sanctions of Russian and North Korean individuals operating in Russia, including some companies. They have been sanctioned for contributing to WMD programs. Given the guidance system that missile has, and given North Korea's own fairly inadequate small electronics industry, they had to get the guidance system from somewhere. So Russia may well have been advancing North Korea's missile threat. Look at the veto. Both China and Russia said they offered the US the alternative of a presidential statement. Presidential statements have a precedence. They were used 3 times in the past on the occasion of North Korea's so-called satellite launches for the long-range ballistic missile test. The US declined to do that. If you look at the draft the US put forward to the Security Council, it was very tough. There were no indications that the US sought compromise on any of the sanctions they were asking for, with either in the bilaterals with Beijing or in the bilaterals with Moscow. So the question is, was the US actually provoking a veto? And if so, were they trying to bring all these conflicts to a head? I don't know. You'll have to ask the US rep at the UN. But it certainly appears that this was the agenda.
So when I hear your response, it's it kind of makes me feel skeptical. Even if North Korea tests nuclear weapons, China and Russia wouldn't support U.S. push for additional sanctions?
China and Russia, when they joined the Security Council, when they joined the UN, they took on the obligation of trying to protect the international community from these kinds of threats. So, yeah, they are obligated to sign on to a Chapter 7 resolution and as a response to a nuclear test. But whether they live up to that obligation is another question. I think China might be inclined to, as I say, Russia, I don't know. Whatever they decide, it would probably be in lockstep. They'd go together on a resolution if it was weak enough, or they would stand together in a veto. But they would expect some negotiation, some weakening of the draft that was circulated for the missile test.
Mr. Snyder, if China and Russia vetoes again, if there was push for additional sanctions after possible nuclear tests in North Korea, what is the option left for the U.S. and allies?
So what you're talking about is how does the U.S. and its allies respond in a world where the Security Council is paralyzed and China and Russia are not enforcing sanctions. And that really just leaves unilateral and alliance-based responses. And I think that's the reason why we see these discussions about a powerful response, primarily emanating from the trilateral coordination process. That's really all the U.S. has as a response. And so, stepping back and looking at the larger picture, the real problem with this situation is that the sanctions that the U.S. uses as the tool to shape North Korea's security environment have been eviscerated. But North Korea's capacity to use testing as a way to shape the U.S. security environment remains. And so that actually puts the U.S. into a difficult situation and makes it less likely that we're going to be able to bring about our desired objective of complete denuclearization.
If UN Security Council were able to reach an agreement on additional sanctions, hypothetically, what are the things they can do differently this time? Is there any area that they wanted to try before in the past, but that they couldn't do?
Well, one new area to bring into sanctions is the cyber threat that North Korea poses and its theft of money from banks. North Korea has no shame. It even stole money from poor Bangladesh. So I think that there could be a consensus built around sanctions that would stop some of this behavior. Unfortunately, some of the North Korean cyber groups operate out of Russia and China, as well as other places. So that makes it a little bit difficult, but it's also an area where both countries could move in a supportive way. In addition, Treasury circulated a notice about the threat North Korean workers pose in the IT industry, where they offer themselves up, sometimes only identified as Korean rather than North Korean, to consult or do contract work on IT projects, where they install backdoors and so forth. And I think a lot more publicity could be given to the threat that this poses. You might expect a little more tightening up on shipping. The draft that was vetoed also sought to end the export of tobacco products, which has been a moneymaker. North Korea not only sells it directly, it counterfeits cigarettes and sells those as well. So there are some areas where I think agreement could be reached on sanctions, depending upon the U.S. Willingness to compromise on some of the shipping ones, which were more of a direct threat to Chinese interests.
So all of the measures that Bill has pointed to are very legitimate things that one would expect would be in a sanctions resolution if, in fact, it is possible for the U.S. and China and Russia to engage in those informal negotiations that Bill mentioned that actually have not apparently been occurring. But then the question I think to ask is, in this particular environment, what would be the Chinese price for moving forward in that kind of negotiation? And if I think about the Chinese position, one thing that I can think of that might be interesting and challenging is that the Chinese would probably like to see a re-engagement of diplomatic dialogue between the U.S. and North Korea. But it's likely that engaging in that kind of process might come at a high price because we know that North Korea's objective is to be recognized as a nuclear state. And it's not clear that China, even though it pays lip service to denuclearization, I think that the Chinese are more interested in having a process by which to tamp down tensions than they are in seeing tangible progress toward denuclearization. So there's a real challenge and interesting dynamic there that one can imagine if indeed a background negotiation were to occur following a nuclear test, but it might not necessarily, but there are risks involved in that process from a U.S. policy perspective.
Then my last question for today, you talked about the re-engagement. Do you see any possibility that re-engagement could take place before North Korea does this nuclear test? Or is it going to happen only after nuclear test?
I never like to predict what North Korea is going to do, but my answer to that question is no. I don't think that a serious re-engagement diplomatically will take place in the absence of, on this side of a crisis. I think that it will only occur on the other side of a crisis.
Why is that?
Well, I think, why is it? Because under current circumstances, neither the U.S. nor North Korea see an incentive in engaging directly, and both are locked into diametrically opposed positions that actually prevent them from engaging in a negotiating process. And it's only after the stakes have been raised that the shape of the table may shift sufficiently that there would be a possibility of a diplomatic interaction.
I mean, I fully agree with Scott. There's another factor at play as well. North Korea's clamped down again because of the rapid spread internally of the COVID. So if you were to engage and you were to accrue some economic benefits, I mean, their borders are closed. So the timing for all of this is just not working out in favor of engagement. There's too many things going on. Maybe once they've taken some soundings of the new regime in Seoul, felt them out a little bit, explored perhaps in offsites or third party, second party talks, get some sense of anything that might be accomplished, perhaps, but we're at least a year out in that kind of context.
For the first time since November 2019, defense secretary and ministers of the three countries, the US, South Korea, and Japan, met face-to-face together as a group at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. The three countries are showing stronger coordination among themselves, more than what we had seen in the past. And let us see whether this could bring a wider cooperation within the international community in terms of dealing with North Korea's provocations. Mr. Newcomb and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.